I hadn't been back to my grandmother's house in years. Not since she fell ill, not since the family started whispering in corners, not since I began feeling like a guest in rooms I once called mine. The morning air was thick with the scent of roses, like it always was in late spring. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, was colder than I remembered. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, knowing what waited on the other side. The will reading that was supposed to be simple. Formalities, legal closure. But nothing in this family was ever simple. The house, the estate, the old arguments all bubbling under the surface. The door opened before I knocked. Aunt Margaret stood there in black silk, her lips tight like she'd practiced disappointment in the mirror. "You're late," she said, as if the whole house hadn't been late in acknowledging me my whole life. Inside, the drawing room smelled like lemon polish and antique books. Dark wood, heavy curtains, and portraits of people with stern faces. I stepped carefully, like I didn't belong. Maybe I didn't. They were all their Uncle Peter by the fireplace. My cousins sprawled casually on the velvet sofas, whispering about assets like it was poker night. Not one of them met my eyes. Then came the voice of the lawyer. He was short, with thick glasses and a suitcase older than I was. He cleared his throat with the kind of gravity reserved for funerals and fortune. "Let's begin," he said, unfolding the will like a sacred scroll. I sat at the edge of a high-backed chair. My hands clenched. My heartbeat pulsed in my ears. "I, Marguerite Rivers," he began, "being of sound mind and memory, declare this my last will and testament." The room fell silent. A tense kind of anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. To my sons, Thomas and Gregory, I leave the family estate, all investment portfolios, and the lake property in Vermont. No surprise. I had expected that. To my granddaughter, Emily, the antique jewelry collection and the family heirloom piano. Okay, still nothing out of place. Then the lawyer paused, shifted. His voice changed, slightly strained. To my adopted daughter, whom I welcomed into my home out of charity and obligation. I froze. I leave no material possessions, no property, and no claim to the estate. She was cared for during her time in my home, and that, I believe, is sufficient. Silence, complete and total. My mouth went dry. For a second, I didn't breathe. "You're adopted. You get nothing." The words echoed inside my skull like gunshots. I could feel their weight pressing on my chest. Everyone sat still. No one looked at me. Aunt Margaret tilted her head and gave a smile so small and cruel it might have been painted on. My cousins shifted in their seats but said nothing. My uncle coughed, probably to hide his satisfaction. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my throat locked. There was no oxygen in the room anymore. No space for dignity. I stood up. No one stopped me. Of course they didn't. I walked through the hall, past the grandfather clock that once scared me as a child, past the stained glass window I used to trace with my fingers. I pushed open the front door and stepped into the sunlight outside. Everything looked the same. Same trimmed hedges, same swing hanging from the oak tree. But everything had changed. They erased me. Not just from the will, but from the family story. Like I had never mattered. Like I was just a footnote in their legacy. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I knew something they didn't. And soon. They'd remember exactly who I was. The bus ride back to my apartment felt like floating through someone else's life. The city passed by in dull colors, muffled and distant. Like it was ashamed of me too. I stared out the window, watching strangers laugh, kiss, exist unburdened. I had nothing but a plastic bag with a half-eaten sandwich and a name that now felt stripped of meaning. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor. In the dark, I wasn't crying. That would have been easier. It's burning slowly. Like the embers of a fire nobody thought was still alive. Hours passed at some point. I stood and opened the closet. There was a shoebox tucked away behind winter coats and forgotten umbrellas. It was battered, dusty, the kind of box that looks like it holds secrets. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all from my grandmother. She had written me often when I left for college. Little notes of encouragement, recipes she thought I'd like, quotes from books she underlined just for me. She signed every one the same. Love you always, Grandma M. I picked up one envelope I didn't recognize. It wasn't like the others. It was sealed in wax, heavy, with her handwriting almost too careful. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter and a photocopy of something else. The letter read, "My dearest girl, if this finds you, then something has gone wrong. I never intended for there to be confusion. You were my daughter in every way. That mattered, and I wanted to make sure you were protected. I signed an addendum to my will in November. The house is yours. I didn't tell the others. I didn't trust them not to manipulate the situation. But the original is kept with the notary, sealed and filed. Use it if you must. I love you more than words can say. M." I sat frozen, the letter trembling in my hands. She did remember me. More than that, she believed in me enough to leave me something no one could argue with. The house. The family home. The only place I had ever felt seen. I searched the envelope. There was a photocopy of the document. It looked real, notarized, dated after the will they'd read, and it named me sole inheritor of the house at 118 Maple Avenue. I couldn't sleep that night. I reread the letter 5 times, each time feeling the fire inside me grow. What they did at the will reading wasn't just petty, it was calculated. They wanted me erased, but they didn't know what I had. By morning, I had a plan. First, I called the notary listed on the letterhead. He answered on the second ring, groggy. I introduced myself and held my breath. A pause. Then, "Yes, I remember you." She was very clear in her instructions. "We've had that file sealed and stored." Hope punched through my chest. I asked if I could come in. He said yes. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in a tiny office, lined with certificates and smelling faintly of coffee and dust. He pulled out a folder from a fireproof cabinet inside the original. Signed, witnessed. Official codicil to my grandmother's will. It was real. It was mine. And it changed everything. I had the legal right to the house, the rest of the estate. Fine, let them squabble. But that house, the symbol of their control, their legacy, that was legally mine. The notary handed me a copy and smiled, like he knew what this meant. "Your grandmother," he said, "wasn't someone who acted without purpose." I walked out of that office with my back straighter than it had been in days. It was time they heard from me, but not in a phone call. Not in a letter, no. I would face them in that house. The one they thought they'd claimed. The one that never truly belonged to them. I waited 1 more week. I wanted to be ready, emotionally, legally, strategically. I made copies of everything. I emailed the lawyer who read the will. I didn't say much, just that there had been an omission. I'd like to present something new. He responded almost immediately. "If you have relevant documents, I can schedule a follow-up with the family." Next Sunday. Perfect. Sunday morning came. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to own the space. I wore the locket Grandma had given me at 16. Inside was a photo of us at the kitchen table, laughing, flour on our noses. I tucked it close to my heart. When I arrived at the house, the gates were open. Funny, they hadn't been open when I came last time. Inside, voices echoed. Laughter, glasses clinking. They were celebrating. Of course they were. The lawyer stood at the base of the staircase, looking nervous. I handed him the document without a word. He read it once, then twice. Then his face changed. He asked me to wait. I stood in the foyer, the same place I'd stood a week ago, feeling unwanted. But now I held the deed, literally and emotionally. He returned, followed by the entire family. They looked confused, irritated, like I was a fly buzzing in their wine. The lawyer cleared his throat. "There's been a legal update," said. "It appears there was a codicil filed and notarized properly that supersedes the previous will regarding the ownership of the family house." Silence, dead, ringing silence. He continued. The house at 118 Maple Avenue is, as of this moment, the legal property of E. Looked at me. Her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at them. Each face stunned and red and angry, and I felt whole. They tried to erase me, but Grandma didn't let them. And now the house was mine. I didn't leave the house that day. After the announcement, everyone just dispersed. Some out of the room, some out of denial. Aunt Margaret disappeared without a word. Uncle Peter muttered something about legal tricks and stormed outside, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. My cousins avoided my eyes like I'd grown horns. But I stayed. The lawyer gave me a nod, a small gesture, part sympathy, part apology, and left without fanfare. The house was quiet now, and mine. I stood in the foyer for a long time, looking up at the chandelier I used to lie beneath as a child, imagining it was a galaxy. Every creak of the wood beneath my feet felt like a small declaration of truth. This place had been my home before it was my inheritance. And now it was both. I made tea the way Grandma used to, strong, with a splash of cream and a slice of honeycomb if you had it. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around the mug, and let myself breathe, not cry. Not yet breathe. Then came the knock, sharp, urgent, angry. I opened the door, and there stood Thomas, my cousin, the one who used to steal my crayons and blame me for every mess in the house when we were little. You planned this, he spat, not even offering a hello. I found a letter. I said, calm, bullshit. Grandma wouldn't leave you the house. Not you. She did, I said, showing him the document again. Signed, notarized, filed, legal. He stared at it like it was poison. You tricked her, he said. You guilted her into this. I felt something shift inside me. A line that once crossed doesn't uncross. I didn't trick anyone, I said. But maybe she saw something in me that none of you did. Maybe she realized the people who claim to be family aren't always the ones who act like it. He looked like he wanted to scream, but instead he laughed, bitter, broken. She's not even your real grandmother, he said. You don't belong here. I stepped forward, letting the weight of my words land where his cruelty couldn't reach. She was more real to me than any of you ever were. And I belong here because she said I do, legally, emotionally, completely. He turned without another word and walked away. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against the wood. I didn't shake. I didn't fall apart. I stood. The next few days were surreal. I moved in slowly, not with boxes, but with memory, okay? I unpacked the shoebox of letters. I hung a photograph of me and Grandma in the hallway. I opened the windows and let the spring air move through the rooms like a second cleansing. I walked the halls like I used to barefoot, careful not to wake the house. I ran my hand along the banister, still polished smooth from generations of fingers, and then I found it in the attic. Behind a stack of old trunks was a small wooden chest with my initials carved into the side. Inside were items I hadn't seen since childhood, a pressed flower I gave her when I was 7, the drawing I made of her garden, a birthday card she never gave me. There was a note, folded small. You were never invisible to me. M. Sat there for a long time, and this time cried. Not because I was sad, but because I finally believed it. I invited everyone to a housewarming on the veranda. I wasn't celebrating victory, I was reclaiming it. Sky was pastel pink at dusk. The air smelled of fresh grass and magnolia. I had set a small table of cookies, tea, and the locket Grandma gave me. Now on display, the family arrived one by one, awkward and hesitant. Some carried pity gifts or apologetic glances. Aunt Margaret's face froze when she saw me poised, confident, rightful. The lawyer stood off to the side, observing. I took a breath and said, "Thank you all for coming. This house is mine now. It's belonged to Grandma, and now it belongs." To me, silence. Then my mother stepped forward. She looked older than I remembered, like the weight of family expectations had caved in on her. She placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "She loved you most. I'm sorry." Tears filled her eyes. I nodded. No words were enough. My cousin Thomas lingered on the porch, arms crossed. I didn't approach him, sat at the table and poured him tea. He accepted it, barely. I raised my cup, and he mimicked the motion. A fragile truce. Later, Grandma's letters were read out loud, one by one, her handwriting curling across each page like a promise. I watched their faces shift. Awkwardness, guilt, shame, regret. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I walked through the house that night, doors open, lights soft. I entered Grandma's room, now empty and gentle. I touched the nightstand where her glasses once sat. I imagined her voice saying, "You were never invisible." I remembered the reading room, the lawyer's voice, Aunt Margaret's eyes. I remembered the cracked door knocker and walking away. Now I walked the house with certainty. I belonged. The next morning, I sat on the veranda, the sun warm on my skin, the house quiet, birds chirped. Wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. I held the locket Grandma gave me and thought about silence and truth, love and loss, claim and belonging. I had one more than a house. I had reclaimed identity. The place where I belonged wasn't a title or a deed, but a story that I lived and a legacy Grandma made sure would endure. As the sun rose over Maple Avenue, smiled softly, I opened the locket and looked at her photo. I whispered, "Thank you."